Right, back to talking nonsense on the internet. Sorry, it's been a while. The project I have this time is one that is at once pretty simple in what I want to do, but also unnecessarily complicated because, of course, it is. I'm a nerd. I do pen and paper role playing, and I need a new space to store my dice. And there's a variety of commercially available dice bags out there. Some of them are quite cool, but of course I want to do it myself, and I want it fancier and more complicated because, duh, of course I do. I'm gonna try to take you along for the concept part of this, but that's gonna be a mess a little bit because a lot of doing the concept is me just staring at empty paper until my brain comes up with something. So it's not quite easy to really visualize that for you, sorry. But I didn't want to leave it out completely because it always annoys me when people go like, yeah, and then off camera I prepared a pattern and now we're gonna do this, great! And I'm like, yeah, but like creating the pattern is kinda relevant, you know? Yeah. Anyways, I'm gonna have my future self, that hopefully has a finished something, explain to you what exactly I'm doing, because I think that's gonna make a lot more sense than if I'm trying to convey a concept that doesn't have a physical manifestation yet. This is what I end up with. We've got one dice bag with 3 separate compartments for dice and any tokens or markers you might need, with 2 pockets for playing cards, with 1 small tray to hold the dice while you're not using them, and 1 large tray so you don't throw your dice through the entire room. I'm gonna go through some of the sketches I made while designing this. One of the main things I wanted is have multiple compartments, because I use some dice much more often than others, and it's annoying to have to search through all the dice I have to find the ones that I want. So some separation is needed. And at the beginning, as you can see here, I thought about dividing it maybe into 5 separate compartments. But then I thought that was probably a little bit too much, because I've got varying amounts of dice of each kind, and separating them each into their own compartment wouldn't really be economical. Also, zippers are kinda expensive sometimes, so I settled on having 3, but on making them not all equally sized, so that some of the dice I rarely ever use can just go into the smallest compartment. This next sketch is a lot more detailed. I've got kind of 3 variations. 2 are just variations of the same kind, which one of them is the variation I end up with deciding on. This was another thinking of like maybe not dividing this, but just having 1 giant compartment with different access points, but not quite. And here you can also see some of the inside parts that I planned, because one of the major issues I have with those that you can buy is that they have a lot of unused space in like the flap that they roll up in. And I thought that was a bit of a bummer, because we can put pockets for playing cards there, or put a dice tray, or maybe put 1 dice tray to actually roll the dice in and 1 dice tray to keep the dice in while not rolling them. Because, yeah, as I said, unnecessarily complicated. That's me. Here, these are some of the earliest sketches of, okay, what is going to be the order in which I put this together, because like the major difficult part of this is going to be in which order these things go together. All the pattern pieces are not that difficult. They're mostly rectangles. But it's going to be very important in what order I sew them together so that I have as few seam lines showing on the outside and being ugly. And here's the pieces that are in fact not rectangles. Those are the side closing parts. And as you can see, at some point I doubted my having different sized compartments idea, because this is just so much more pretty and symmetrical. But in the end I decided that yes, I want to have different sized compartments, which is why I looked at this, which is kinda not making me all that happy, because they just look mismatched. So going from that, I drew up this version, which has a little bit wider angle at this point than this one has. And I already also cut this out because these are gonna be my pattern pieces essentially. And then for the dice trays, I made a couple of paper prototypes, I guess. The large dice tray is essentially going to have snaps at each of the 4 corners, but like for the small dice tray, that kind of seemed out of proportion to me, so I fumbled a bit about, and this is the one that I'm currently looking at, which is also folding up, but making use of this part here. So essentially it's going to only have one snap there that is going to hold it all together while it is in this position. But hopefully, if this actually worked out, you already have seen this in action, because you already know all the fuck-ups I'm going to make or not make, because future self has probably told you. And then you might wonder, why did I go for this size for the side parts? And essentially it is because one of the dimensions is already given, because I found these zippers for pretty cheap. And this just seemed to me a size that would look proportional, hopefully. No special math happened there, this was just by eye. And then last but not least on our preparation list, of course, is fabric choice. And for the outside I've got this cork fabric, which I think is a really cool material. I think I've seen it used instead of leather. It's surprisingly thin. I mean, it's not really thin, but not all that sturdy, which is why the major inside fabric is quite the sturdy one, which is, I think, originally intended to be used in upholstery and things like this, but I really like the colors and I like this pattern. The third one is the lining, but I really talked enough at that point. I'm drafting and cutting out the pattern pieces, which, as I already said, are mostly rectangles, and I'm giving you the specific dimension of those at the end of the video. For all pieces I'm drawing the actual pattern piece, and I'm just eyeballing how much seam allowance around it I'm gonna give it, because I usually end up with surprisingly consistent seam allowance that way, and it saves me some work. I started drawing the lining pieces onto my lining fabric, and I originally thought that I would need to split each lining into 2 parts so that I could reach inside and sew up some seams on the inside, which actually now I've realized I only need to do on one of them. I'm actually still wrong in that correction because none of them need to have the middle seam that they end up having technically. But it does help me out because it's a little bit complicated to get all those pieces together in the right order. And so in the end, it was probably more like a happy little accident than really an error, because those 2 centimeters of fabric saved me probably a lot of nerves while sewing it together. And because my chalk was acting up, I did the drawing in non-removable pencil because I thought, I've got this. This is simple. And like, it's not a major issue at all. I'm just frustrated right now, and maybe don't do major thinking in the middle of the night next time, Lena. I finally cut out all of my pieces, which took me a lot longer than I've shown you. And as you can see, there's quite a bit of things here. I'm gonna go through it in more detail, but just generally speaking, this part over here is going to be what's going to be the pockets where the actual dice are. This is kind of the main flap that goes around the pocket part, and these are the things that get applied to it. Over here we've got the pieces for the 2 dice trays, and this little thingy is what's going to hold playing cards. And then of course we've got thread. I've got 2 buttons that will not actually button anything up, but they will hopefully serve as a reinforcement for the snaps, because this part for the playing cards is only a single layer of that cork fabric, and I'm not sure if it will hold up all that well if it doesn't have something to hold on to. And then I've not yet fully decided if I actually want to add some elastic to put pencils in, or if they can just go in with the dice. I so thoroughly do not do this that I don't even mention it ever again in this entire video. Right, these are the pieces for the main pockets. Obviously we've got the zippers. Then we've talked about this being the lining pieces. We of course have parts that go on the ends, and then the lining pieces. You've seen me get frustrated about cutting these in a way that was a bit unnecessary. We've got 2 different sizes for these. The line you see that I've drawn is the seam line, and the seam allowance I've just roughly cut out. All of this is going to go on the inside, so I don't have to finish any of the edges. Some of them are kind of finished. I've zigzagged over them when I pre-washed the fabric, and obviously I'm not going to cut that off. That would be useless. And then these are the corresponding pieces of the outside layer. Here of course also we've got the pieces that go on the sides. I've tried to somewhat pattern match them so that hopefully they will look nice. How well I did on that you will already have seen, and I will have to wonder about for a while. I've put a little mark on those that should be on the same side, so that hopefully this will work out. And then this is going to be the large piece that goes on the bottom. That will be essentially the outside, and these are gonna be the 3 pieces where the zippers go in between of them. And now these are the shenanigans that go on the inside. The most interesting is probably this one, but I'll just go over these quickly. These are the dice trays. They've got on the underside, because these are gonna fold up to some degree. They've got some of the fabric, and the inside of them, where the actual dice are gonna roll, is that cork fabric. They're gonna get snaps here on the edges, and because I didn't want it to get too bulky, I'm gonna sew around these outside edges with some bias tape. which I apparently completely forgot to film. Sorry about that. And now for the one piece that is not a boring rectangle. This is where the playing cards will be able to go. And essentially it's like back in school during math class and you were doing geometric shapes. This will fold up on itself. These little flaps go inside here. For this to be essentially a cuboid shape when it's sewn onto the fabric. This will be quite fiddly getting on, I imagine. And essentially it's two of them right next to each other. This dashed line in the middle is where it will sew down in the middle of them onto the green fabric. These little cutouts are only there so you can grab the playing cards a little bit more easily. And then these are the flaps that will go above them and prevent the playing cards from falling out of this. I'm starting out with sewing most of the snaps into their respective places, and they all get reinforcement of some kind. The closing flaps for the pockets get buttons so I don't accidentally rip out the snap, and for all other parts I attach a small piece of fabric on the inside so that I don't just have one layer of fabric for it to hold on to. I attach the smallest pocket piece to the main flap fabric, and then I can still sew the first seam of the card pockets with the machine. The rest of it I'll have to do by hand because the machine wouldn't be able to go inside there. I have already ironed the main flap piece where it's going to fold over to encase the decorative outside panel of cork fabric, because as the construction goes on it will be more and more difficult to access that, and doing it beforehand gives you a head start. Remember when I said I was making things unnecessarily complicated? Yeah, this definitely is one of those steps. I'm essentially doing a ladder stitch on what is going to be the playing card pockets. And these are tiny, and if you don't like fiddly work, this is definitely something you could either skip or simplify. I'm just putting myself through unnecessary pain, essentially. Most of the side seams was done with a ladder stitch, but at the topmost part I'm putting in some back stitching to make it stronger and not break as easily. This is placing the last couple of snaps, and I was a little scared that the stitching would be ugly on the outside, but actually it's barely visible, so yay! So best laid plans of women and mice don't work out if your paper pattern does not account for the bulk of the fabric that you're gonna use. So folding it up this way like I planned in the paper pattern does not actually work, which is why I had to change plans, sew on these snaps on just this side so that when they go together like this, they still form sort of a tray. This looks a little wonky right now, but remember that this will be partly sewn down onto the main flap of the actual bag, and that will help stabilize the shape I want. The next step is inserting the zippers. For that, I've sandwiched the zipper in between the lining and the main fabric, with the zipper facing the main fabric. And to get an even seam line, you at some point have to open the zipper to get the zipper head out of the way. And in between those layers of fabric, that is fiddly and not quite easy to see. We're dealing with the second side of the zipper here. And with what I said before about it being fiddly and difficult to see to get the zipper open, yeah, for the same reason we have to close it up now, and it doesn't get easier with more pieces of fabric in the way. And to make everything look nice, our zipper gets a bit of top stitching on either side of it. I've sewn in all 3 zippers right now, and what we've got now is one very, very long strip of strategically sewn together things, and this part is gonna fold under, make the actual pocket parts, and here on this part we're gonna place the tray parts, and then below here will go the decorative part of the flip. Whatever, nobody cares. But before we can do that, we have to sew the lining into actual pockets rather than just 2 flaps of fabric. For that, I'm first closing up the middle seam and then inserting the side pieces of the lining. This is how the completed linings look. I've done most of this by machine, but some of it by hand where it got too close to the zipper. Moving on to the outside of the pockets, I'm first attaching the side pieces in their respective place. Make sure you don't accidentally catch your lining in these seams. At this point, we start to get a first idea of what we're actually trying to make. For these rounded seams, I actually found it easier to start twice in the middle of the round part and then sew towards each point individually rather than from one point to the other. Also remember to leave yourself a bit of seam allowance at the transition to the main flap part. One pinning nightmare later that frankly should have been basting, not pinning, but I'm lazy. We now, if we turn this part inside out, are getting closer to actually see what the point of this is. Because we now have the part of the 3 pockets that need to be properly turned. Inside there's the lining, we've got the zippers, and we still have to put a seam in between the individual pockets so that they can fold up. For these seams again, make sure to not accidentally catch your lining in them. I put a bit of red thread from corner to corner to help me with sewing on the dice trays, because any basting stitches would have stayed visible in the cork fabric. We're taking big steps towards the finish line now. I've sewn down the 2 tray parts, which close up like this. Come on. And like this. And so the only 2 parts left to do are putting in the outside piece of cork fabric and of course closure. And then we're done. Here you see me sewing the finishing seam for the last pocket, which on the back side also is the transition into the cork outer fabric. And this time I did baste it because apparently I sometimes do listen to myself when I'm giving advice, though not nearly often enough. This tiny little seam, after cutting away the excess fabric and turning it inside out, turns into the corner of the main flap surrounding the decorative panel on the outside. Final step. Sew around the outside of your decorative panel, make sure to not catch any of your gadgets on the inside, and at the front fold your ribbon in half and include it in the seam so that you can close up your back. And this is how I made this dice bag. And if you want to do one, but the version I've made seems a little overcomplicated to you, there are a few things that could be simplified. One thing that isn't difficult per se, but takes a bit of time and detail work is these sew-on snaps. There's other kinds of snaps that you can just put in with a special set of pliers that go in quicker, but these sew-on ones were the ones I had, so that is what I used. Then definitely one of the most fiddly parts was these plain cut pockets. If you don't want to do this, just either skip them or don't use a fabric like I did, and instead use one that is a little bit thinner that you can just sew here on the outside and just like place it on top and sew around it rather than having to do the ladder stitch to have a clean finish like I have. One other thing is I'm aware that that probably also wasn't easy to see, was how the lining went in. You could either skip the lining entirely. In that case you'd have to finish up the seams on the inside, but it would totally work without the lining. If you still want to have a lining but you don't want to have that complicated sewing the lining in while also sewing the zippers, while also putting the outside parts. Just sew the lining pieces together individually and insert them afterwards. It won't maybe look quite as neat, and or you will have to do parts of it with more hand stitching to get it neat, but that's definitely a way to be done. And then one more part that is definitely a bit more complicated than you have to make it is having this decorative panel of a different kind of fabric. One thing you could definitely do to make this easier is just skip this panel, make this part of the fabric longer, so that you just continue this seam on the outside here the entire way around, and then you don't have to worry about how to iron this, because this fabric did not want to iron. Really, that was so annoying. And it would also save you having to hand sew this part here where the playing card pockets are, because I had to hand sew that because this seam is essentially inside the playing card pocket and the sewing machine would not have gone there, or at least not made a pretty seam. If anything during this video was unclear to you, if you've got any questions, if you want to make this yourself and need a little bit of guidance, please feel free to comment and ask questions. I would be so super happy if anyone would want to make one of these for themselves. So yeah, please feel free to interact, feel free to ask questions. And with that, all I've left to do is pack up my new pretty dice bag. Say thank you very, very much everyone who's watching this, everyone who's giving me feedback on this. It makes me really, really happy. Bye bye! Why do I never know what to do with my hand?